Welcome to meeting number 28 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Human Resources, Skills and Social Development and the Status of Persons with Disabilities. Colleagues, I understand that we are anticipating bells to ring to summon us to a vote at 5:15 Eastern. When the bells start to ring, I will be asking for the unanimous consent of the committee to continue until our appointed hour, being 5:30. So I just want to give you a heads up for that. Our hope is that we'll get in the full 2 hours, of course, if needed, because the second half of today's meeting is drafting instructions. Today's meeting taking place in a hybrid format pursuant to the House Order of January 25th, 2021. The proceedings will be made available via the House of Commons website. The webcast will always show the person speaking rather than the entirety of the committee. Pursuant to Standing Order 108 sub 2 and the motion adopted by the committee on Wednesday, October 28th, 2020, the committee will resume its study of the review of the Employment Insurance Program. I'd like to welcome our witnesses to begin our discussion with 5 minutes of opening remarks, followed by rounds of questions. We have with us today from the Canada's Building Trades Unions, Sean Strickland, Executive Director from the Canadian Chamber of Commerce, Leah Nord, Senior Director, Workforce Strategies and Inclusive Growth, and from the Workers' Action Centre, Pam Frake, Organizer. For the benefit of those witnesses, I'd like to make a few additional comments. Interpretation for this video conference will work very much like a regular committee meeting. You have the choice at the bottom of your screen of either floor, English, or French. When speaking, please speak slowly and clearly. And when you're not speaking, your mic should be on mute. With that, we're going to begin with Mr. Strickland for 5 minutes. Welcome to the committee, Mr. Strickland. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. It's a pleasure to be here this afternoon, and good afternoon, and thank you for the opportunity to address the Committee on Reforms to Employment Insurance System that reflects the needs of Canadian workers. Sean Strickland's my name, Executive Director, Canada's Building Trades Unions. We represent 14 international construction trade unions, and we have over 500,000 members across Canada. Reforming employment insurance has long been a high priority for Canada's building trades unions, and the pandemic has put a light on cracks in the system, as you are very much aware. I want to thank the committee for the work that you are doing. We appreciate the government's measures to support Canadians through the pandemic, unprecedented times for sure. The recent extensions of benefits through the budget, Canada Recovery Benefit, Canada Emergency Wage Subsidy, and extending sick leave will help workers through this unprecedented time. We're also encouraged by the announcement we heard from the province of Ontario today in terms of paid sick days, and we are looking forward to the successful rollout of that program as well, as it will help our members deal with the pandemic. The construction industry accounts for 6% of Canada's GDP, and the industry has been a key player in keeping the economy going during the pandemic. However, industry employment is down from pre-pandemic levels, with unemployment nationally at 8% and much higher in certain regions of the country. The additional supports to the CERB have helped bridge the gap, and permanent reforms to EI are an opportunity to better support workers in the long term. In our brief, we have included 8 recommendations to update the EI system. I'd like to expand on a few of those in the time I have. Let's talk about apprentices. Currently, apprentices enrolled and participating in the in-class portion of their apprenticeship, which often only lasts a few months over a period of years, often do not receive their entitlements from EI until after training is completed. This wait creates an economic barrier for apprentices to complete the in-class portion of the training and challenge the certification exam. To grow Canada's skilled trades workforce, we need to expedite EI applications for apprentices to allow them to receive EI payments faster and complete their training. As we look to rebuild our economy, we recognize the changing nature of work, and we've included recommendations to extend the EI training support benefit, address the limits on the Canada training benefit, and support workers seeking retraining or skill upgrading. there are a few key areas that we need to focus on. For example, Canada's energy sector is changing. As it changes, so does the nature of work, and a just transition, including skills retraining, needs to be included to make sure no worker gets left behind. We need to lessen the confusion of navigating the system to ensure more workers can utilize training programs and benefits. As the economy changes, we also need to crack down on employer misclassification of workers, who are often labeled as independent contractors or self-employed, allowing employers to evade EI and other payroll deductions. A recent study in Ontario by the Ontario Construction Secretariat indicates loss of revenue to governments in the magnitude of $1.8 to $3.1 billion annually. Addressing the misclassification of workers will help broaden EI's base, prevent free riding and undercutting competition. Canada's Building Trades Unions is also requesting that dedicated EI program liaison officers be restored. Think of an apprentice who doesn't know the system. They submit a report to an EI office that redirects them to apply for other similar jobs, not understanding the cyclical nature of construction and how a union hiring hall works. This not only confuses the apprentice, but leads to deferring apprenticeship completion. CBTU recommends that each of Canada's 4 regions has its own liaison officer who can understand specific issues pertaining to the region and the building trades. I'd like to also talk about getting Canadians back to work in the construction sector. There's a private members bill in the House, Members Bill C-275, which will help get workers back to work across Canada. Unlike many careers, construction is temporary in that you build a project, complete it, and then move on to the next. This can require workers to travel and temporarily relocate for work, costs which could be too much for a worker and disincentivize them to travel. This can create labor shortages in different regions with high unemployment in others, something a skilled trades mobility tax deduction would address. Currently, the temporary foreign worker program is a tool used to support labor shortages. However, it is not being implemented accurately with labor market information data. This has become a bigger issue in certain trades and regions, particularly in BC, and we need to better address how temporary foreign worker applications are reviewed. Make it easier for skilled trades workers to travel to where the work is, rely less on temporary foreign workers and government programs like EI. I thank you for this opportunity, and I look forward to answering questions later during the deliberations. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Strickland. Next, we're going to hear from the Canadian Chamber of Commerce. Ms. Nord, welcome back. Glad we've overcome our technical challenges. You have the floor for 5 minutes. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair, Vice Chair, and committee members. I'm speaking on behalf of the Canadian Chamber of Commerce. We represent 200,000 businesses across the country, across sector, and across sizes, with our network that includes 450 chambers of commerce and boards of trade from coast to coast to coast. I am delighted to be here successfully this afternoon, and I thank the committee for the opportunity to speak about the importance of employment insurance program reform. For a number of years, the Canadian Chamber has been calling for a comprehensive review of the EI program, and the pandemic has further demonstrated the acute need for EI modernization. I appeared before this committee, the previous iteration of it, just about a year ago in May 2020. And in speaking to the need for EI reform, I stated that in moving forward, we needed to identify the reform needed to build a system that can respond to current and future workforce needs, ensure Canadians remain connected to the labor force, and that somewhere there is a strong component of upskilling and reskilling for displaced workers. I say the same thing today. Our recommendation is as follows. The Canadian Chamber recommends that the federal government immediately start a tripartite-led comprehensive review of the EI insurance program through discussion and data-driven decision-making to ensure that the EI's governance, programs, policies, and operations are viable and sustainable, responsive and adaptive, nonpartisan, inclusive, and relevant for current and future generations of Canadian employers and employees. In the time that I have remaining, I will make a few brief comments on aspects contained in this recommendation to provide further contextualization. And I'm actually going to start with my last one and work my way back, hopefully with time. So my fourth and likely most important comment is that the EI system must be viable and sustainable. Under the current iteration of EI support, you have heard from ESDC officials that there is an additional $10 billion in EI benefits that are being paid under the expanded EI eligibility, admittedly mostly by government as premiums are frozen, along with over $10 billion in expenditures for 3 additional benefit programs, the CRB, the CRCB, and the CRSB. Further, over the past weeks in this review, you have heard recommendations that have included permanently expanding EI eligibility, changing zones, expanding sick leave, and adding additional income supports, raising the payment floors, and including for other active measures. Quite simply, how much does this cost and how can it reasonably be funded? I will return to my first comment and close with that in a moment. Another recommendation within this is that the reform system must be inclusive. We believe that with one important caveat, and that is the fact that the gig economy does not wholly equate to precarious work. Again, I spoke in front of a previous iteration of this committee at length in April 2019 about this and can further elaborate in the Q&A period. But the bottom line is until we determine where and the challenges and issues lie with a gig economy, we should not be jumping to program solutions. And any solutions should be optional, responding to the needs and desires of the gig workers and self-employed themselves. Our third recommendation here is this review must involve discussions, not consultations, that are tripartite-led, a true social dialogue. A reminder that the EI system is supported 7/12, 58% by employers, and 5/12 by employees, 42%. Business and labor must be at the table in a meaningful way, and the EI Commission must continue to play a central governance role. Our final recommendation is to first note that the EI program is complex. This review must be comprehensive, examining both parts 1 and 2 with all the moving pieces therein. A necessary approach is to take a step back and up and look at modernization through a lens that focuses on the future of work and what is needed to have an adaptable system. This includes some of the following points. A, teleworking and working from home, urbanization, ruralization, labor mobility, both within and outside Canada. B, professional pivots, upskilling, lifelong learning, education and training. C, digitization, automation, industry 4.0, artificial intelligence. D, all sorts of workers, foreign workers, seasonal workers, older workers who are staying longer in the workforce, self-employed workers and gig workers. And E, what the foundation for all of this, which is economic competitiveness. So just in conclusion, we must take a look at the big picture and looking forward on what is needed. And then where it belongs is not everything can or should fit into the EI program and how it could be afforded. In this regard, decisions need to be data-driven and costed. We can look at other examples either internationally at Australia, Denmark, Germany, or even here within Canada, for example, the Canada Pension Plan, Workers' Compensation Plan, or the QPIP. Thank you, and I look forward to answering any questions.
Thank you, Ms. Nord. Finally, the Workers' Action Centre, Ms. Frake, welcome to the committee. You have the floor for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. I'm glad to be here. Yes, I'm an organizer with the Workers' Action Centre, but I'm also speaking today as a signatory to the submission by the Interprovincial Employment Insurance Working Group. This submission is signed by over 80 labor and frontline advocacy organizations, and it contains recommendations that are grounded in workers' lived experience that could, and with recommendations that could transform access to EI for millions. I'm sure you are all well aware of the fact that today, only about 40% of unemployed people are receiving EI income supports when they're out of work. And I'm sure you all also know that in urban centers, the situation is even worse, with only about 30% of unemployed workers receiving income support. I want to use my time today to help us understand why this is happening. First of all, I want to say that I think we need to disabuse ourselves of the notion that seasonal work is pertinent to only particular industries or provinces. If we replace the term in our minds of seasonal work with the term non-full year employment, it's very easy to see that the issue of non-full year employment is an issue everywhere, in urban centers as well as rural areas, and from the education sector to the retail sector. We know that fluctuating demand for services results in non-standard, non-full year employment. Let's remind ourselves that the services sector now comprises 80% of all jobs in Canada. That's a remarkable transformation. In retail, the average work week is only about 28 hours. So the notion of a 40-hour work week or even a 35-hour work week is of a bygone era. And I do agree with my previous colleague, we also must end the rampant misclassification of workers. Too many so-called gig workers are actually ordinary workers who are in fact misclassified and are entitled to all the protections and entitlements under the law. So why is it that workers are not getting EI when they need it? I want to run through three broad areas. One is workers are simply not getting enough hours to fulfill the hours requirement. And so while we welcome the recent announcement of a single universal standard of 420 hours to qualify for EI, we believe it should be reduced further to 360 hours or 12 weeks of work, whichever is best for the worker. And we believe this should be the standard for both regular and special benefits. And of course, this change must be made permanent. And if I get a chance, I'd love to elaborate on this further. Number two, workers are disqualified from EI when they have a quit or fired on their record of employment. This rule is punitive, unnecessary, and fails to recognize the reality of the labor market today. Until there is strong, just cause protection legislation in every province for every worker, there's no denying the arbitrary nature of firings in the workplace. In Ontario, the employer doesn't even have to provide a reason for firing a worker. At the same time, workers also quit their jobs for a variety of very legitimate reasons, including racism on the job, scheduling changes, or even for health and safety reasons. And while we're getting rid of arbitrary rules, I'll just say COVID has reminded us how important migrant workers are to the economy, and we must get rid of the punitive and arbitrary rules that exclude migrant workers from accessing regular and special benefits. Lastly, a big reason workers are not getting EI when they need it is because they've exhausted their benefits because they don't last long enough. Now I want to turn my attention to the improvements in EI income supports. So not only do we need to make sure EI is there for when workers need it and when the economy needs it as well, we also want to make sure it's enough for workers to live on. And let me just say that 55% of income is not an adequate replacement. And especially when you think of the poverty level minimum wage rates across the country, 55% of a sub-poverty minimum wage is simply unsustainable. We need income replacement of up to 70%, 60 to 70%, and the earnings should be based on workers' best 12-week of income. In addition, we should be raising the ceiling on insurable earnings. This would have the effect of increasing revenues for the EI fund, as well as increasing weekly income supports. And finally, on the question of revenue, EI is currently funded solely through employer and employee contributions, as was noted. We urge the federal government to come back to the table and put its pillar of funding on the table and restore the three pillars of funding that used to sustain EI when in the heyday. We know that this system can do what it needs to do for workers and for the economy. We just need to now implement the changes that are going to make it happen. We should have a comprehensive review. Any of the temporary best changes that have just been announced should be made permanent, and let's find the political will to make it happen. We know from COVID, this is the time to do it. We can't wait a minute longer. Thanks very much for your time.
Thank you, Ms. Frake. We're going to begin now with rounds of questions, starting with the Conservatives. Ms. Doncho, please, for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for your excellent opening remarks. Took a lot of notes. It's just wonderful to have so many experts here today, so thank you for being with us. Ms. Nord, I have a number of questions for you. Thank you for your remarks. And again, you mentioned you represent over 200,000 businesses in Canada. So I'm really looking forward to hearing some of the feedback you've heard from those businesses and their experience with EI and how it can be improved for everyone. And you outlined a number of these things in your opening remarks. But before I get into that, I just wanted to ask you about the EI Employer Commissioner. As we know, there has not been an EI Employer Commissioner since, I believe, January, when the former commissioner was not renewed, and there has not been a replacement. So I just want to get your perspective of why is an EI employer commissioner important, and why do we need someone at the table as soon as possible, given we're talking about reform? So go ahead.
Good afternoon, and thank you for the question. And it is a critically important position because the EI Commission, which is tripartite, is the basis and is the foundation of the governance of the EI Commission. We have stated that remains to be, that should remain as the centrality of the governance system. So in the absence of an EI Commissioner for employers, there are consultations, there are discussions, and there are decisions being made without the voice of business at the table. We have expressed our concerns. We have written most recently, there's 15 business associations that wrote a letter at the end of March to the minister to express our continued concern in the absence of this critical time. And even as somebody is onboarded, we understand it is an issue of importance. We're told it's imminent, but there's still going to be a period of onboarding. And we're all aware of this looming September deadline. So it is of great concern to us. Thank you.
I appreciate that, Ms. Nord. And we had the Minister Qualtrough in, and she had opportunity to answer a lot of our questions from committee members. And when I asked her about this, she did sort of defer to, well, she's met with CFIB, and she's sort of, and I don't want to put words on her mouth, but my takeaway was that she was relying on CFIB, which is an excellent organization, does that similar work and research to yourself, to the chamber. But do you feel that relying on CFIB rather than an EI employer commissioner is adequate given the September deadline you mentioned?
Again, CFIB is one of our close business partners. We do have a group of 6, and even under the EI commissioner, under the previous one, there was a group, it was called the Business Liaison Group, and she convened a group of about 30 businesses. So you get the full voice and breadth across, not only sizes, but sectors across the country. And it is important because you'll see that there are different concerns and different priorities within the EI system. So it's the full voice being heard. Thank you.
Yeah, no, that's great to hear. And that you've been consulted on that as well, it sounds like.
We made ourselves consulted, yes.
Oh, okay, great. So I'm glad to hear that she's consulting you, consulting CFIB. But do you believe that's a replacement? Like, do we not need the employer EI commissioner then?
Yes, absolutely.
That we do need it?
Yes.
Okay, I understand. I think we may be saying the same thing, but I'm miscommunicating. Thank you. I did want to also get your perspective on the last year. Can you just sum up? I know we only have a few minutes, but what is the weight and the pressure on business in Canada, and how critical is it that I would say I have heard concerns from businesses in my riding that I've met with that they're concerned about EI long term. We know there's a premium freeze, but they're concerned that it's going to skyrocket with a legislative change or something, and that could be sort of the last straw for them. So can you elaborate on some of the concerns you're hearing and any sort of forewarning we need to be aware of should EI premiums go up substantially when the moratorium is done?
Yes, and thank you for the question. I mean, what I would say first of all is we are grateful that in light of the expanded EI eligibility that premiums were frozen. We don't have an indication of what that will look like outside of that, and it is very concerning. You did hear from colleagues at CFIB last week, and their figure is that our members are $170,000 in debt right now. The Canadian Chamber partners with Stats Canada on something called the Canadian Survey for Business Conditions. The most recent survey data came out in March, and I would note that that's before the third wave that's hit many jurisdictions across the country. And survey data from that indicated that 50% did not know how much longer they could operate without going into bankruptcy, and that 40% of those that had under 20 employees could take on no more debt. 29% of those in the size range of 20 to 100 could take on more debt, and those with over 100 employees. So we're getting into our medium and bigger size. Almost 1 in 4 of those cannot afford to take in any more debt. So as we look at this, I know this is only one piece, but it's a bigger puzzle of any number of things, and would note that already our businesses did take a hit with the recent rise in the CPP premium rates within the program as well. Thank you.
And so how many employees do you think could be impacted by this? I mean, you mentioned that you mentioned a number of statistics. So if we don't get these programs right, and it sounds like the government in their budget, to their credit, has extended them.
Yes.
But if these programs are at risk or whatever may happen after September, how many employees, how many Canadian employees could be impacted by your estimate?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, credit where credit is due, and we are thankful that those wage subsidies and those new programs have put in place for business. It would be difficult to put a figure on it, but what I will say is that small and medium-sized businesses constitute 98% of this country's business community. They are the majority, like 90% of a business driver of economic growth and of employment. I mean, I think statistics around between 2013 and 2017 are about, 90% of employment comes from them. So that's important. And it's also important to start looking at our bigger companies as well that are on that K-shaped crisis and on that downward curve as well. The impact will be significant. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Nord.
Thank you, Ms. Doncho. Ms. Nord, next, Mr. Long, please, for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and good afternoon to our witnesses. A very, very interesting testimony, and I thank you for that. My questions will be for you, Mr. Strickland, from the Building Trades Union. I certainly want to acknowledge first the great working relationship I have with people like Steve Schuman, Matt Whalen. We've worked in different initiatives together, and I'd certainly be remiss without saying that the MLA in my riding here is Arlene Dunn, who was a former director of the Building Trades Union. So I talk to Arlene almost on a weekly basis here. We've been very excited, speaking about projects for trade unions, about the recent federal announcement of $57 million here in St. John Ross for the small modular reactor projects, and we think that holds great hope for the future, certainly not only for Southern New Brunswick, but all of Atlantic Canada. So my questions for you, sir, would be as follows. I'm wondering if I can get your thoughts on the recent additions, changes to the EI outlined in Budget 2021, ensuring that severance and other separation monies do not delay unemployment insurance benefits.
Well, thank you very much for the question, Mr. Long. I really appreciate it. And thanks for remarking on the relationship with Matt from the IBW and Steve from the operating engineers. Yeah. I'm sure they're watching. I'm sure Arlene, who I've known for a number of years, is not watching. She's busy working on issues in the New Brunswick legislature. So, and I know Arlene's being active on the small modular reactor file as well. And that's something that we're really encouraged about. And it is related to my remarks in terms of transitioning workers from traditional oil and gas energy sector into new energy projects of the future. So small modular reactors, hydrogen, carbon sequestering, these kinds of projects are going to take large capital and investments. And it is also going to take investments into training programs through our union training centers and also more broadly through the community college system to help train workers for the new greener economy. And not even talking about retrofits for commercial and residential buildings and industrial buildings. So that's a real important file, really important to our members, the creation of these new cleaner technologies and the training that's required. Right. In terms of the, permanently abolishing the clawback of separation monies, is a huge benefit to our membership, and we're really quite thankful to the government and to Minister Qualtrough for including that in the budget. And we've had conversations with the minister and various other MPs around the importance of this to our members. And it's just really a question of what's fair. Separation monies for our union members are actually money that they had earned while they were working.
Yep.
So, and it's just basically a holdback from the employer. So you're actually, you know, under the previous regime, you're actually being penalized by delaying your EI claim on earnings that had already happened previously. And so this is a really good positive step forward and well received by our members who have to access employment insurance.
Thank you for that. Can you expand on how EI payment delays impact apprentices?
Sure. Well, so apprentices have to go through an in-school portion for training. And so depending on your trade, it dictates how much in-school training you have. In various jurisdictions in Canada, we have what's called compulsory trades. So, for example, you know, tower crane operators, mobile crane operators, electricians, plumbers, and steam fitters, and sheet metal, just to name a few. So those compulsory trades have a higher requirement of in-class learning than other trades that are voluntary. The voluntary trades still have in-class learning as well. But the challenge is, and this is where it really hits the road, is that if you're a worker and you're a younger worker and you have to go into a community college, for example, or an IBW training center to complete your in-class portion of training, you apply for EI, and oftentimes you could be there for 3 to 6 weeks. Oftentimes the delays are such that the apprentice does not receive their EI dollars until their training's done. So they're waiting 6 weeks without a paycheck.
Right.
So apprentices, they talk to each other. So what do? Well, I can't afford to go 4 to 6 weeks without a paycheck, so maybe I'll defer my in-class learning. And so when they defer their in-class learning, it stretches the length that it takes to get their certification and delays their training and delays their ability to perform as a certified tradesperson.
Okay, thanks for that. Just in one of your brochures I pulled up here today, there was some talk about the misclassification of workers. So I just wanted you, if you could, to expand on how EI payment, talk about why workers in the construction industry are misclassified. Like, how does that happen and why?
This is a huge issue, and you heard the stats that I reported from the Ontario Construction Secretariat just for Ontario alone, $1 to $3 billion a year. And so what happens is I'm a contractor. I have to hire 10 people to perform my work. Rather than bringing them onto my payroll, I describe them as as independent operators. They're independent contractors. And so as being an independent contractor, say they make $2,000 a week. I give them $2,000. It's up to them to pay EI. It's up to them to pay CPP. It's up to them to pay taxes on that. Well, how many of those workers actually do that? And so that creates a problem. There's a lot of missed revenue there for governments. The other thing is that these workers are often exploited. And then in terms of a competitiveness factor, I'm that contractor who's got these styled workers as independent contractors. I got 10 employees. I'm going to bid a project against a union contractor, for example, who's got 10 employees, but is paying them all the requisite dollars and wages and making the necessary remittances. So the contractor who's misclassifying these workers as independent contractors has a competitive advantage against a legitimate contractor. But I'm still not breaking the law by styling the workers as independent contractors. And so this is a real problem for the construction industry. And you may recall years ago, I think it's 10 years ago, there was a terrible swing stage accident in Etobicoke in Toronto where 3 workers fell to their death. One survived tragically was impaired for life afterwards. Each one of those workers was an independent contractor.
Thank you.
And so this is a real challenge for our industry.
Thank you, Mr. Strickland. I appreciate
it. Thank you, Mr.
Long.
Thanks,
Chair.
Madame Chabot pour 6 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
Madame Chabot for 6 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would like to thank our witnesses for being here. My first questions will be, I hope that I will pronounce her name well, Miss Fresh. My first question, in your presentation, you raised an interesting issue. The idea that the government should once again contribute to the unemployment insurance fund or the employment insurance fund. And we know that the EI working group supports this idea. So in your opinion, why is it so important that the government funds a part of it as things were at the early days of the EI system?
Important question that the federal government plays an important role in providing the funds and resources so that the EI system can actually include all the workers it needs to include. And as a reminder, as my colleagues have also said, is that funding EI is an investment in the economy, not just in workers, but making sure that EI is there when we need it, helps to stabilize the economy. It's good for business so that there's not a catastrophic drop in consumer demand as workers are without income supports and so forth. And I think we've been talking about expanding access so that it can be a genuine economic stabilizer, but I think it may seem daunting if we don't actually put all the funding streams back on the table. And the federal government has always been, a third partner. It should be stepping up. It has an obligation to, or it has a role in determining how the economy unfolds as well. So we all have a stake in it. Employers have a stake, workers have a stake, and the government has a stake. And we should be funding the system so that it's there when all of us need it.
Merci.
Thank you. Well, for a long time, the government no longer funds the employment insurance program. Thanks for your answer. My second question, in the 2019 report, the control and evaluation of the EI program, it's a yearly report. We were told that workers that were paying premiums but were not receiving any benefits because they had not accumulated a sufficient number of hours to qualify, or the employers, as another witness said, gave some false information about why people quit their jobs. In your opinion, is it time to set these wrongs right?
Again, very important questions. Around the hours question, even though technically EI eligibility is determined in the number of hours, even if you think about something like 420 hours to qualify, what that translates into is a worker having to work a full 35 hours a week, uninterrupted, for 3 full months. To be honest, and especially this is true in urban centers where temp agency workers are there's more, the saying goes, there's more temp agencies in the GTA than there are Tim Hortons. So this gives a sense of what's possible and what's not possible. Imagine retail, the average work week is 28 hours. You can see how long it would take for consistent employment for workers to be able to access the program that they need when they have an interruption in earnings. So reducing the hours is extremely important. And we can see what would have happened in the COVID crisis had we not reduced hours to 120. So our committee is recommending that we reduce the hours to 360 or 12 weeks, whichever is best, in order to be in keeping with the realities of today's labor markets, where people might work for 6 weeks and then have an interruption, and might work for another month and have an interruption, may not get 28 hours a week. This is the reality of today's labor market, and it helps explains why so many people aren't accessing EI when they need it. And again, on the question of quits and fires, it's absolutely true that we need just cause protection to prevent arbitrary decisions by employers. And let's also talk about the conditions that exist that cause workers to feel like they need to leave their jobs and find another job. And as I said, racism in the workplace, Sometimes an employer will change the schedule and it's just incompatible with that worker's childcare responsibilities. Or sometimes it's health and safety issues. People who work at Amazon warehouses, their bodies wear out. Their bodies wear out, and there's legitimate reasons why people quit their jobs, and sometimes they have to do it on the very quickly. So yes, we should get rid of these arbitrary rules and make sure that EI is there for workers when they need it. And thank you so much for the important questions.
Monsieur le Président.
Mr. Chair, do I still have any time left? Well, 20 seconds. Well, my 22nd question will be for Ms. North from the Canadian Chamber of Commerce. I understand some concerns about the need to reform, and if I understood what you said, it would take time. People are saying the time has come to act, that there have been sufficient number of studies done, all sorts of indicators, and we already know that there are certain things that we can change right now. Would you agree that we have to intervene more quickly?
Give you a bit of time if you could answer it as briefly
just
as
very
possible.
quickly.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Just very quickly, we need to act, but we need to act prudently. We need to act on decision, data-driven. Everything gets thrown at the wall, and we have to sort of sort it all out. What belongs where? Does government belong paying within the system? We can't comment because we don't know how much it costs. Maybe it's a better system to take a lot of what's currently in there out of there and have it focused. So it does need to happen, but it needs to happen tripartite discussions, and it needs to be costed and data-driven before we can make any final decisions moving forward. It's really important to do that. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, Ms. Ashton on behalf of the NDP. Welcome to the committee, Ms. Ashton. You have the floor for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. Well, my first question is to Sean Strickland. And before I begin, I also want to express my solidarity with IBEW members here in Manitoba that are fighting for a fair contract from Manitoba Hydro, and really appreciate the work that they do day in and day out. Mr. Strickland, I know you've talked a bit about this earlier in this meeting, but I'm wondering if you could elaborate more on how employers' misclassification of workers allows them to evade paying into EI, and how this business practice undermines competition by placing EI paying employers at a disadvantage. Why is this a problem in the industry? Is it getting worse? And what needs to be done right now to put a stop to this?
Well, thank you very much for the question. It's a very, very important issue for the construction industry. And, what I say is, the only really substantive data provincially on this is from Ontario. And I indicated earlier, $1 to $3 billion a year. But you can take that on a percentage basis and roll it right across the country. I mean, it's happening in every province. And I can't emphasize enough how this misclassification of workers really curtails the amount of revenue that's available to provincial and federal governments to fund programs like EI. Also, how it puts workers in a vulnerable position where they're easily exploited by their employer because they don't have any real protection. And the other thing it does, which is often not spoken about, and I mentioned earlier, Ms. Ashton, is the competitive nature of it. And so you can have contractors who are bidding for municipal contracts, for example, who don't have to make those payroll payments on behalf of their employees because they've styled them as independent contractors or independent operators. And so they're able to bid for a project and save that money and undercut the legitimate contractor who is making those appropriate payroll remittances to Revenue Canada, CPP, et cetera. So it puts workers in vulnerable positions. It does not afford them the kinds of protections that normal workers would have in an employee-employer relationship. And it also negatively impacts more legitimate contractors who are bidding for these work and making the right payments. And the challenge is that the contractor who styles his or her workers as independent contractors is not breaking any law. So you can't say that they are operating illegally, but through styling their workers in such a way, they're able to get a competitive advantage over contractors who pay their workers as they should pay them as employees. So it's a problem on a multiple of levels. In terms of solving the problem, I know years ago, the other thing I didn't talk about was workers' compensation claims. In Ontario, they tried to solve it by making it mandatory to pay WSIB. I don't think that has solved the problem. I think that there just needs to be government regulation or legislation that severely curtails the ability to style a worker as an independent contractor. That's the only way you're going to solve this.
Mm-hmm. I appreciate that. I do want to now turn to Ms. Fresh from the Workers Action Centre, and I want to truly acknowledge the incredible work that the Workers Action Centre does on behalf of workers, and particularly non-unionized precarious workers, which is, of course, a growing working class in our country and a struggling, very much struggling working class, particularly during this pandemic. I'm wondering if you can tell us, I know you've touched on it a bit already, but what do we need to do? What do we need to see this government do to make EI accessible to precarious workers in Canada?
Yes, thank you for the question. Well, I think reducing the hours threshold and making it permanent, as I said, the step toward 420 is a good step forward, but it really needs to go down further. That is a very important aspect of it. Because as I said, basically the EI thresholds are still based on weekly earning or weekly hours of 35 hours. And as I was explaining, for most workers, 35 or 40 hours a week is just unheard of. And steady employment is also unheard of. So I think that's a very important point. We also need to make sure that we raise the actual amount of income supports for workers, because honestly, when you're in a low wage job, not even just a minimum wage job, 55% of income is just not sustainable. So we need to think about raising the floor of EI income benefits, to potentially 60 to 70% would be good. And we saw what we did during COVID. We had a floor of $500. So those are the kinds of things that we have to do to make sure that EI is not only there for workers in precarious employment, but that it sustains them. And I do think the other aspect of this is also extending the duration of benefits so that it's 50 weeks across the country, because just because you may get the EI in the front door, but then you lose at the back door because you haven't been able to get another job in time before your benefits run out. And as you know, if you've got low qualifying hours, then you have low access to duration. So those things are related. So we need a much longer duration. I will do a shout out for raising the sickness benefits from 15 to 26 weeks. That's very important. But I think, again, should be extended to 35. And I think COVID, the long haulers, we're getting all of this evidence to say these are essential changes. And one last thing to say about migrant workers as well, they pay into the system like all of us pay into the system, and they were absolutely essential for our economy. We need to make sure that those workers are protected and that EI is there for them as well, because they're contributing to it just like we all are.
Thank you, Ms. Frey. Ms. Ashton, you will get a 2.5-minute turn in the second round, and we're going to proceed to that second round now, beginning with Ms. Falk, please, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair, and I'd like to thank all of our witnesses for contributing, or taking time out of their busy schedules to contribute to our study in our committee today. So thank you for being here. I would like to start with my questions for Ms. Nord. I'm grateful that you made yourself available to us again today, because I think it's so critical that we are hearing from job creators who will be directly impacted by any changes that happen to the EI program. This committee has now heard from a few witnesses that have had the recommendation that the government not implement any permanent changes to the EI system until our economy has recovered, fully recovered after this pandemic. So I'm just wondering if the Chamber of Commerce would also share that viewpoint. And if so, what impact would significant program changes in advance of an economic recovery, what would they have on your membership?
Mm-hmm. So I do know a number of our business association partners have come out very clearly with the position that any temporary changes that have been implemented to various degrees of understanding through this pandemic period not be made permanent until which time that we are through the pandemic. I think this is something that we would concur with. Having said that, the time to start discussing this is now. Again, September looms large, and so does the EI premium freeze. The impact that we could have could again be crushing, right? It's all of, I spoke to the struggle that is real for large portions of our membership, the big, the small, and the otherwise. And you look at this as one piece, but they're the other pieces as well, right? And they're already starting behind the 8 ball with the amount of debt that they are incurring. And the other concern that we have is that how these burdens and as they increase will affect hiring prices and hiring practices and getting Canadians back to work. Thank you.
Yeah, and I think too, just in this pandemic as well, when I look at some of the small businesses, I'm from Saskatchewan, so it's interesting as well too, just the differences in restrictions and the lack of consistency, which I understand, but the unpredictability as well on some of these small businesses. Very difficult for them to adapt, even though a lot of our small businesses have been so creative in how they can get their products out in a safe and effective manner. We know that creating opportunity and growth are foundational to securing a strong future for all Canadians. And to succeed in that goal of a stronger, more prosperous future for all Canadians, fostering a competitive and fair environment for our job creators, it must be a priority. So with that in mind, are there areas of the current EI program, whether it's administrative or structural, that should be reformed?
Yes, and thank you for that question. I've spoken to a number of principals in an EI reform, and I think another one for everyone involved would be simplification. And I know that that's easier said than done, but both from both an employer and arguably an employee point of view. I mean, Sean had spoken to this idea of navigators and navigation, and increasingly this is, in even the appeals process as well. That's important, and even more important than navigators is probably removing the need for navigation. Thank you.
Yeah, and I think too, simplicity is so important. So is plain language. We have heard over and over again in this committee how important it is for plain language so people can understand. When you have all this, jargon of words that people don't necessarily understand, it just deters them from accessing or attempting to access something that might be available to them. And I guess, Ms. Nord, quickly before my time ends, is there any program reforms that you would caution against, given the possibility of their potential impact on business competitiveness?
Again, a great question, but it's really hard to say individually without looking at the totality, right? We haven't even talked about part 2 of the EI program and LMDAs and all the programs that it funds there. So you can't say one thing without understanding the ramifications off the board, and that's why we argue it needs to be comprehensive. Thank you.
Wonderful.
Ms.
Thank
Nord.
you.
Thank you, Ms. Falk. Next, Ms. Young, please, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and I'm going to be sharing my time with my colleague, MP Morrissey. I'd like to start with Sean Strickland because I wanted to take this opportunity to thank your members for the hard and often dangerous work you do. You talked about an accident, I think, in Toronto. Well, a couple of months ago, there was a terrible construction accident in my riding of London West, when 2 workers were killed when a wall of an apartment building under construction collapsed, and there were others injured. But it really underscored how important your workers are and how we often take them for granted. And you mentioned earlier about apprenticeship training, and I wondered how the safety issue is impacted by EI benefits in the discussion that we're having today.
Well, thank you very much for the question. And I do remember the accident you're referring to. And unfortunately, I'm sure each member from each of their ridings would be able to point to an example of a similar accident in their own ridings. And I think generally it's important to recognize that construction is a lot safer now than it was a long time ago. And so construction continues to put into place best practices. There's core certification. Health and safety is a core value of the unionized construction industry in Canada. And there was recently a report from the Ontario Construction Secretariat again indicating how safe unionized construction is. And so this is a core deliverable of all of our training. So all of our training is built around safety, safe practices. And EI, I guess when you talk about training in general, MP Young, is that, there's some questions here about recommendations to simplify the process going forward. And I think one would be like the EI today isn't the EI that was, 25 years ago. And I remember a long time ago when I had to submit my cards and send them in through the mail, that I really think that this training aspect, particularly giving post-pandemic recovery, needs to be, to whatever extent, hived out of the employment insurance system. Employment insurance and income support program, it needs to be sustainable. I believe the Chamber of Commerce on that. Hive that training out, then we'll get that training out, get more Canadians to have access to it, and include safety as a component of it. And you're going to see improvements in safety in cooperation with labor unions and businesses right across the country in all sectors.
Okay, thank you very much.
Halfway point there, Ms. Young.
I'll pass it over to MP Morrissey. Thank you.
Mr. Morrissey, welcome.
Thank you, Chair. Good to have a chance back on this committee, which I spent a number of years on. I have a question for Ms. Nord on how would you respond to the comment that the EI system is an integral and very important part of seasonal small business, vis-a-vis the seasonal small business depends on an adequate EI system to keep the worker, their trained worker, available for the next period of work. Would you agree with that statement?
Yes, we do realize, and I had made reference to that, though,
yes.
When we do look at it going forward, our seasonal workers, I would argue that in this day and age, a seasonal worker is not a seasonal worker across sectors or across the country geographical location. So it's I would actually say that they are important, but they're not a hybrid or an overall construct these days either.
So having a EI system is important in maintaining that seasonal workforce, especially for seasonal small business. I have a question to Ms. Frake. You referenced a 12-week as a minimum, which actually I would agree with a national standard, minimum standard. Where would you view in the area of importance? Because there's been a different discussion in this panel and today, and I haven't heard the history on it. But is it more important to have a minimum EI ceiling or a maximum? Because right now we during the pandemic we have 500, where in the past a lot of people can receive EI so low that they cannot survive on it. Goes all the way. I would argue as a politician that it's very important to have a minimum threshold for those people that work in low income jobs in small weeks. Could you opine on that, Ms. Frake?
Yes, I think it's absolutely very important to have a minimum floor. Imagine trying to live when in a province where the minimum wage is $11.90 an hour. Like living on 55% of that is just untenable, even if you were lucky enough to have full-time work. So I couldn't agree more that we need to have a minimum level of income supports for workers so that people can survive. And remember, their survival is also about the survival of the local economy, because when workers have money in their pockets, that's precisely why EI is an economic stabilizer. And I think we can't be thinking about it as just merely an expense. We have to think about that money going back into the economy, back into local businesses, and stabilizing our economy until it is able to recover. So I agree fully with you that we need minimum and a much higher proportion of income that's insured. That being said, we also need to raise the ceiling on how much income is insured, because I think people think, okay, I have an okay job, maybe I make $30,000 or $40,000 a year, and you think maybe I could live on a portion of that, but when you see what 55% of a capped income actually is at $45,000 or so, or $50,000, it's not enough for people to live on. So I think we need both. I think we need the minimum weekly amounts of support, but we also need to raise the ceiling on insurable income, because that will actually put more money in people's pockets as well as increasing EI revenues for funding.
Thank you, Ms. Frey. Thank you. And thank you, Mr. Morrissey. Suite Madame Chabot pour 2 minutes et demie, s'il vous plaît.
Madame Chabot, for 2.5 minutes, please. Thank you. I will try to go quickly, and I will try to allow the witnesses some time to answer. My concern with what I'm hearing is that for businesses, for workers, we have to wait for things to stabilize before we bring in reforms. I would just like to remind you that even before the COVID, there were all kinds of shortcomings in the EI system. The figures we hear for workers that are excluded, I'm hearing 60%. That's huge. And the labor market, our businesses also need workers. So strengthening the EI system, which brought about this study, would appear to be very necessary, and even more so in the COVID context. In your opinion, should we intervene quickly to correct some of the errors in the system? Are there messages that you could send us clearly today? Who wants to go first, Ms. Fresh, or anyone else?
I do think we need to move quickly on this, because as you well pointed out, that we knew right away that as soon as COVID hit, the old employment insurance was not up to the task. And I do think it is important that we address the major barriers to EI. And what's exciting about this is that it's doable. If we actually do this, EI can be restored to its heyday when it protected workers and the economy at the same time. So reducing hours, eliminating the quit fires, and extending the duration of benefits. Because another aspect of extending the duration that's good for the economy is allowing workers to find jobs that fit their skill set, instead of them having to take survival jobs as they hit the benefit cliff. And then having to take a survival job that doesn't make the best use of their skills. And so again, an effective EI program is good for the economy, it's good for workers, and it's good for making the best use of skills. And I do think it's urgent, because we can't wait, and COVID has shown us that.
But I would ask, how much, what does effective look like, and what does it cost? What does it cost both employers and employees and the system? We're not able to answer that until we have concrete answers to those questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Nord. Merci, Madame Chabot.
Finally, if I
quickly,
Mr. Chairman, if I just can add quickly, absolutely quickly, I think the time for major reforms is now, and I think you can do that within the window of sustainability.
Well done. Thank you.
Especially if the federal government steps up with its portion of the funding.
And next, Ms. Ashton, please, for 2.5 minutes.
Great, thank you. And I wanted to go back to Ms. Fresh from the Workers Action Center. I'm wondering if you can touch on the urgency that's needed here. What have you been hearing from precarious workers, I know you referenced Amazon workers during this pandemic? How critical is it for EI to be reformed? And what kind of situation are they facing more broadly? And maybe perhaps you can touch on what are the implications on all of us when an entire class of workers, particularly precarious workers, is falling through the cracks.
Yes, it's absolutely devastating to those workers, and it's devastating to the economy. And I think that when we talk about a 30% of unemployed people in an urban center receiving EI, that's 70% of unemployed workers not getting it. That isn't just bad for workers. That is also terrible for those for the economy. And so I think we have to ask ourselves, what is the cost of not doing it? Because our economy would not have survived if there weren't urgent measures to reduce the hours to 120 so that people could actually get access to the supports they needed. So yes, it is absolutely urgent. And I wanted to talk more about temp agencies, because I think the temp agency workers, it is absolutely ballooning in terms of workers in short-term jobs, moving from workplace to workplace to workplace. What we're seeing so well, what we saw in long-term care is, the deliberate creation of part-time jobs that makes it more difficult for workers to access EI, people having to string together jobs, all the additional paperwork associated with that, all of those things are terrible for the economy. And so we need an EI program that is modern, that reflects those challenges, and that actually protects workers and the businesses that those workers support. Because it's very important to never forget that EI isn't just another social program. It is a fundamental economic stabilizer that every employer depends on, as well as workers.
Well, thank you for that. I know a few of us have been commenting on how so much of what you're talking about, what needs to be done, has been fought for years. So the question of urgency is so important here, right? The question of political will. I'm wondering perhaps if you could touch as well on what you're hearing from workers in areas. You mentioned migrant workers, also workers in warehouses. What is the reality that they're facing right now?
Yes.
Very quickly, please. We're past time. Thanks.
Yes, very quickly to say people are being forced into very unsafe working conditions, and those are people who still have their jobs, and people without jobs are having difficulty getting the income supports they need. I wanted to touch on how many workers come through the center who have been either fired for no legitimate reason and are therefore not able to get their access to EI, or punitive things taking place where people are marked down as fired and so forth, or don't get their record of employment and they're denied their access to EI. All of these things could be made so much easier if we reduce the hours requirement, we extend the duration, we get rid of the punitive rules, the quits fires, and that we actually have a minimum amount of EI supports at 60 to 70% of. Say that the 55% income replacement is the lowest replacement rate in the 80-year history of employment insurance. And I will also mention that the premium rates are actually quite modest right now. They've been higher at different times. In the 80s, they were much higher. So the truth is, it's not out of control. We can do this. We can do this collectively. We can protect workers. We can protect the economy, and we can do it responsibly. And especially, we can do it if the federal government gets back into the business of funding EI, so it's there when all of us need it.
Ms. Doncho, please, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Ms. Nord, I have a few more questions for you concerning, you mentioned in your opening remarks that not everything should be included in EI reform. And we know that EI has so many pieces. It has a skills development piece. It's got maternity and paternity leave, sick leave, caregiver benefits now. Like, all of these are critical programs. And I just wanted to know what you really meant. What did you mean by that? And what do you feel the EI program should look like with reform? And how do we kind of manage all of these moving pieces?
Again, thank you for the question. And that's, to the point that it is complex, right? You have part one and you have part two. So part two, again, is a whole different, kettle of wax with funding that goes through. And we would argue, again, simplification, and an additional principle we would have is transparency. right? Where that funding goes and how it's spent and who gets to decide what. And then in the part one, right? I can argue, you know, different organizations, different people around this table have different opinions, right? Whether it's education and training, special benefits, it's not sickness benefits, right? It's not to say that sickness benefits aren't important, but at what point and how much, right? Do we do it so we don't strain the system? Special benefits as well, right? I mean, I've heard discussions here of sort of an account, right, that you can draw down on, which is also interesting as well, but different people have to draw down for different things, including, for example, in a maternity leave. You know, there's a gender aspect to that. There's also, you know, how much you pay into the, you know, in an insurance scheme. And the point is to help you through temporary periods of unemployment. And I think we really have to get back to that core mandate. Not to say other things aren't important, but this is it. Let's look at the future of work. Let's look at what's needed and then start mapping out what's needed where and how. Yes, there is an urgency, but this has to be done properly as well, or it will break the system. Rates have been higher in the 80s, but what would they look like right now if there wasn't a freeze? We don't even know that actually. So,
and my understanding is there were significant cuts to EI in the 1990s, and those cuts were a result of the debt crisis that was in part generated by many years of deficits by the federal level in the 70s. And so I have concerns, and I know employers have concerns. I know you have concerns of just the debt that we're taking on today. Are we going to be facing a debt crisis in a few years, in 10, 20 years, 5 years, that we're going to have to make significant cuts to social programs that, as been outlined this year, are, you know, Canadians are relying on? And so do your, you know, you represent 200,000 Canadian businesses. Are there any concerns regarding future cuts to EI and what that may mean, maybe the burden that they may be burdening as a result? And you've just mentioned in your opening remarks in particular that you said there should be no permanent changes at this time because we're not quite sure how we're going to pay for it yet, given the fluctuations we've seen in the last year. So if you just comment on that generally.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would argue, you know, to first answer the question, we can look back. I mean, we are in a current crisis, but again, we need to look forward. We need to look at what the future of work looks like and then respond to it as well, right? And you've heard any number of examples here, right? Lessen the hours, raise the floor, you know, put in more income supports. We need to map that all out and see what it looks like, you know, and you saw from CFIB, you know, most recently, their data is a little more recent than ours, how you know, the business community is really split. But my members would argue we don't have a position on whether government should come in as a third party tripartite funding, because we can't make an informed decision on that because we don't have the costing. We don't know what this looks like. And this is the opportunity, right? We have been talking, we know before what needed, but this is the comprehensive review rather than these little pieces of patchwork that keep layering the burdens onto the system until it breaks. It needs to be sustainable. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And that sustainability is so key. And we know that if the government does come in, the federal government does come in as a third funder, we know ultimately that government doesn't create its own money. That's from the taxpayer as well and from business taxes and the like. So it's just another way that people and businesses contribute to EI through the federal government. So not necessarily solving the issue of the cost to workers and employers in that regard. And I do believe that's all my time. Thank you, Ms. Nord. Appreciate your comments.
Thank you, Ms. Doncho. Mr. Vaughn, please, for 5 minutes.
Thanks very much, and I really liked the three parties talking to each other. It was actually informative to hear you bounce ideas back and forth. In particular, because you talk about tripartite with government there, but it's the evolving workplace, it's the traditional workplaces, and it's the businesses that are sort of caught in between those two moving dynamics that are what we're trying to wrestle to the ground here. I've got a quick question though for Ms. Nord. We have had a parade of boutique applications of EI. Paternity, maternity, sickness pay, seasonal workers, temporary foreign workers, maternity, bereavement, training, every issue of income support that needs a solution, EI seems to be the answer. Can we accommodate all of those one by one without breaking the system?
That's the $1 million question, right? How much pressure can be put on this system? I can say that education and training is important. I can say that we have to look at zoning. You know, someone can say reducing hours, raising the ceiling, right? But you can't look at them singularly. I would agree. You have to look at the totality and where
one of them will be literally
overall.
the straw that breaks the camel's back.
Yeah, exactly.
Even
right.
though
And
they're all compelling.
Right.
Okay.
And that's it. And it is very difficult when you talk about sickness benefits. It's not to say they're not important, but how much are they? Like, let's have a data-driven discussion on what is
Fair
needed,
enough.
where it sits. Thank you.
Okay. To Madam Frack, the issue of mandatory EI contributions has come up, in particular around contract, gig, temporary, you name it. I mean, there's 100 different ways to describe precarious work, some by choice, some by force. But would you support mandatory EI contributions?
I think that there's the bigger problem here is misclassification of workers who are constituted as independent contractors who should be constituted as workers, and that should end. But I do think there should be a provision whereby those bona fide individual self-employed people have an option to opt into the EI program, and I do think that that's.
I'm hearing the word option, to not mandatory but option. Fix the classification, but if you're a freelance journalist, for example, who chooses to submit articles here, there, and everywhere, you should have the option of signing in, as opposed to somebody who is a freelance for one particular company endlessly.
Yeah, I think there's a way of doing it that would accommodate those people, and I think there is a model in Quebec around the childcare program that we could draw from.
Okay. The other issue we're hearing more and more about from all different corners of the House of Commons is basic income, whether it's universal, guaranteed, ... There's many versions of basic income as there are of democratic reform sometimes, maybe more. But almost everybody pays for the concept by amalgamating all income support into one pool, because it's an extraordinarily expensive proposition if it's the more it's universalized. Basic income versus EI. Is one better than the other in your perspective? In other words, if we're going to support income supports, should we move away from EI and just go to basic income, or do we need to sustain EI as a plug and play management of sort of the ups and downs and the fluctuations in the workplace?
I think that we need to maintain EI because it has actually served its purpose historically there, and because it's actually funded by employers and by workers, and hopefully in addition the federal government. I think it represents additional revenue streams. I myself am skeptical about basic income in terms of its ability to ensure that workers have everything that they need, and we don't want to inadvertently create an incentive for employers to adopt sub-minimum or sub-poverty business models and create precarious employment because we have a publicly funded revenue stream that's going to top that up. So my concern is maintaining EI. I think it's got a proven record. We just have to go back even a couple of decades to see how effective EI can be in terms of addressing workers' needs. And the recommendations we're making, I think, are very important to that goal.
And to Mr. Strickland, the issue of training comes up a lot with EI, and one of the clumsiness of the old system, largely because the clumsiness of the old computer system, which is older. I think I'm the oldest member here today, even older than me. I thought it was COBOL, not COBOL. That's how old it is. I didn't even know the program language that uses the computer dynamic. But the issue is this: do we modernize and make EI more nimble so it can go day by day as opposed to week by week? Do we invest in upgrading the IT system to make it more nimble, or do we split training into a separate category and leave EI for unemployment effectively, as opposed to the in and out of training and the skills upgrades that we are so invested in? What's your perspective?
Well, great question. I can't answer the question with respect to system designs and computers and so on, but I did say earlier, Yvonne, that I think training should be separated from employment insurance, and we should be able to provide the right kind of focus on the income support program, which employment insurance is, and put a singular focus on training. And you talk a lot on this committee, and part of your mandate is about the future of work, and is the EI system responsive to the new and modern economy? And if we're really serious about that, we need to give training the attention and resources that it needs. Like the training system you have right now, I saw some stats, I don't have them at my fingertips, but just look at the amount of workers that are eligible for training and how many of those workers access the training. You see a huge gap. And so part of it is just the ability to navigate the system. So it kind of comes full circle to your question. I think maybe, the system does need to be updated. It needs to be more nimble. But moreover, I think training needs to be separated from the employment insurance system and have its due attention and separate ministry, in my view.
Thank you, Mr. Vaughn. Thank you, Mr. Strickland. And thank you to all of the witnesses. This was a very comprehensive and fascinating panel, an excellent one for us to wrap up our input from experts across the country. So I want to thank you so much for being with us. Thank you for the articulate and comprehensive way that you presented and handled all of the questions. We're going to move now to drafting instructions. So you are welcome to stay, but absolutely free to leave. And thanks again. It'll be extremely valuable to us.
Thank you.
Okay, colleagues. Normally we would do drafting instructions in camera, but I just want to remind you that we are not in camera and we will proceed in that fashion unless there is a motion to proceed otherwise. We have been provided with a draft report outline from the Library of Parliament, and at the risk of putting our analysts on the spot, I think it would be appropriate to first ask Eleni or Mayra if you would like to offer any comments on the document that you've put together for us, and then we'll open the floor for members to offer advice and drafting instructions. So to our analysts, anything you want to say before we start the speakers list? Go ahead. Yep.
Sure, Mr. Chair, thank you. So as requested by the committee, we have prepared a high-level outline, including some themes that may have arisen from the evidence, in addition to an overarching review of employment insurance. We also have some more specific themes included. And so we would be looking for input from the committee on themes that may have stood out to them, as well as any gaps in the themes we've identified, as well as any recommendations that members have on the structure of the report.
Okay, colleagues, the floor is open. We're going to begin with Ms. Doncho and then Ms. Shabbat. Ms. Doncho, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to the analysts for your hard work on this. I thought it was an excellent first draft and seemed to encompass a lot of what we talked about. One thing that did stand out to me was Part H, the employment insurance financing. I was surprised to see that very far, like at the very bottom of the report. I do think this is a very critical report as we've seen the impact on Canadians and the need to improve the EI system. But I do believe that the financing of EI shouldn't be sort of buried at the bottom, but should be front and at the beginning of or near the beginning, somewhere in the beginning of the report, to ensure that there's a full sort of costing for various initiatives. I know our NDP colleague, Ms. Gazan, is very keen on UBI. There could be a costing in that as well. I think that sort of costing brings a significant amount of legitimacy to the EI program and the reforms we're talking about, and a number of the initiatives that were proposed both by MPs but also by the witnesses that we talked to. So I think it's important for the legitimacy of the report that we don't shy away from the cost or the benefit of it, and that we have that front and center. And there should also be involved in that the premiums for employees and employers included as well. I'd love to see some charts. I know there's been great work done by the PBO and others that we could perhaps pull on. But I do feel strongly that we should be seeing a robust financing section that should be earlier on in the report. So that's one of my opening suggestions, Chair.
Thank you. Madame Shabbat.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And once again, I would like to thank our analysts for their work. And yesterday, we received another report that we'll be able to study. So thank you very much for all that you do. So regarding what we have received, I say I agree. And I agree with Ms. Dancho. So after talking about the background, I think it's important to talk about the funding, the financing of the employment insurance program. So we all know how the financing work, contributions, etc. But perhaps the order could be changed, just like Ms. Dancho suggested. I have a question now. And I know we spoke about this. So if you look at the motion, what is the last section? Reforms outside the employment insurance program. So section I. I'm not saying that this is not interesting, those reforms outside the employment insurance program. But we are talking about EI, its modernization. So I don't see why we would, at the end, talk about affordable childcare and pharmacare. I don't know. It's not as relevant, in my opinion. So we should not add that at the end of the report. I don't see the link with EI. Thank you, Ms. Chabot.
Please.
Great, thank you. So there's a couple suggestions that I did want to pass on behalf of my colleague, Leah Gazan. One was to ensure inclusion of perspectives on the guaranteed livable basic income and how it could work in partnership with EI, as well as ensuring perspectives on the expansion of EI sickness benefits. Obviously, we know that that was something that was somewhat addressed in the budget, but many, as we even heard today, are calling for Canada to go further. And then I think also some key points that also were raised today was the particular perspectives of precarious workers, and that could even be in the context of this crisis where we saw, precarious workers in long-term care and in other heavily impacted workplaces. What it means to expand EI to make sure that it's available to them, and then migrant workers as well, who, as we heard again today, pay into EI but aren't able to access it.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Ashton. Ms. Dancho.
I wasn't sure if the analysts want to jump in on the first round, because I have a few things, as I'm sure some of us do, to discuss. So can we hear from the analysts on some of that first? And I don't know if we lost one of them either. The lovely Elena. I see we have
She's
other
still
lovely
around.
ladies. Okay.
She's just her screen is frozen
currently,
but she's still around.
Okay.
Yes, no, with regards to financing, if I may just reply to that comment.
Sure.
The only reason why it is there is because it is the same approach that we followed with the previous EI report. So no other meaning attributed to it. So we can certainly move it up if that's what the committee wishes for us to do. That's not a problem at all. And regarding the reforms outside the EI program, that's just to reflect witness testimony. Again, if the committee wants it out, it can be removed. So we're happy to proceed in whatever manner you suggest.
Thank you. Back to you, Ms. Dancho.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for your remarks there. And I did want to support my block colleague in saying that although those the sections in I think they are critical and perhaps we could study them in this committee, I don't know if they don't really necessarily add or take away, but they just seem a bit out of place. So I do agree with Ms. Chabot in that regard. One thing I also thought could be included was a mention of CERB, and not so much CERB on its own, but sort of the necessity of CERB, where EI failed, why CERB was needed, and where there was some shortcomings in that EI CERB stream, and then sort of how that was met by CERB. I think we would be remiss if we created an EI report in the year of the pandemic when we created this, or not we, but the Liberal government created this entire new CERB program to meet the shortcomings of the EI system. It just seems odd not to mention CERB in there at all, given how connected they were and are. So I would just suggest that we have a section about that in here.
Thank you, Ms. Doncho. Mr. Vaughn, please.
Yeah, I think MP Dancho is correct in terms of foregrounding the how we pay for this, because it's very easy to point a finger at any one of the three seats at the table, but it all has implications, and I think that's critical. I also think it's just as critical in that process to identify a number of witnesses who talked about how constantly layering on these little tiny solutions to precarious income, whether it's structured because of life circumstance or whether it's industrial circumstance or what have you. But every time we try to fix a little problem with EI, we create a bigger problem downstream, because, as I think the last person agreed, one of them will be the straw that breaks the camel's back. And I think we need to take responsibility for that as MPs. All parties come forward with these little discrete, what they think are small improvements, but when you take them on totality, there's a real challenge we're building, addressing very compelling arguments. I don't think any of us disagree with the compelling arguments. We all support them. They usually get passed unanimously, but there is an impact, and it limits our ability to deal with some of the bigger issues, which we clearly see on the horizon, especially around the gig economy. The second thing, which I'm going to slightly disagree with this notion of sort of sidelining or excluding things like CERB, things like basic incomes, things like the sort of the big picture items that people often veer towards when they think they can solve the EI crisis by simplifying EI and dealing with all the complexities with another program. I think that we need to understand that the reason people are landing at 17 different versions of basic income, or the reason they're landing with this notion that CERB taught us everything we need to know and just take the learnings of CERB forward, is that we still have structural issues like seasonal work here. And basic income it may be the answer to the seasonal work challenge, because it may be the thing that actually locks people into income and therefore provides some answers. So I think that the alternative models of solving some of these channels have been raised by many of the witnesses, and I think we need to include it, but I would include it as an appendix rather than as a set of key recommendations, just because I think it moves us away from fixing EI, which is the fundamental reason we're having the study and the reason Madame Chabot brought this forward. It's about fixing EI and making EI do what it was originally intended to do, as opposed to make it do everything else under the sun. The last thing I'd say around the drafting instructions, which I think also is derived from some of the testimony we heard, is the computer system. I don't know how we fix any of these issues without understanding the complexities, the cost, and the urgency of addressing the IT challenges. We can't do day-by-day supports around training. We can't do the seasonal work in and out quickly as people job share. We can't pivot when we have issues of a day lost here and a month lost here and a week lost there. If we don't have a computer system that responds in real time, we have all collectively as parliamentarians over a number of generations refused to make the switch from COBOL to a modern system. And I think we're now gun shy with Phoenix. It taught us that you can't just simply buy a new system off the shelf and plug in a new computer and things will work fine. IT doesn't work that way. It never has. And so I think we need to really understand that nothing is possible without that IT being addressed. And with IT addressed, it gives us perhaps the flexibility and the nimbleness that we need to deal with an ever-changing employment landscape and employer landscape, and let's face it now, pandemic landscapes, because this isn't the last pandemic, nor is a major climate change events not going to create the same situation with forest fires and floods. So we really have to lean into that IT situation, and we have to be brave and not shy away from it.
Mr. Vaughn, Ms. Ashton, please. Is Ashton okay? Madame Chabot.
Merci beaucoup. Thank you so much. Well, Madame Dancho, the question of the CERB, or even more, all those measures that were set up had to be set up on an emergency basis when we saw 9 million workers being unemployed, it's on CERB, it's on flexible unemployment insurance measures, and the 3 new measures that were announced. Naturally, we have to look at this in the context when we talk about temporary measures that were put forward due to the COVID pandemic. That's where it lies. Now, we saw how we had to adapt. And this could be very useful. I would like to say to the analysts that for seasonal workers, what we call the black hole of employment insurance, we have to look at what witnesses said about that. We'll have to be specific because many regions of Canada are hit by this seasonal industry and the black holes in EI. So it's up to you to get this information. I really did appreciate the last report we'll work on Tuesday. I agree with Mr. Vaughan. If this report lies on testimonies, naturally there weren't that many witnesses, but we know, moreover, that there were a lot of briefs. We haven't heard all witnesses, but we've received a lot of briefs. People had up to April 9th to table these. So this is more information to support the report. But as you said, and as you know how to do about it, the report must be a reflection of solutions, problems, and issues raised by the witnesses we've heard and whose briefs we've received. I trust you on that. And I will conclude by saying that we could have reforms also outside of the program, and the report shouldn't be too complicated because it's of the society's interest, but not for this report. Thank you, Mrs. Chabot. You're so right. We have received 30 witnesses' briefs, submissions, written submissions.
I think that's because she didn't lower it last time, but last call, Ms. Ashton, if you wish to make an intervention. Not really last call, but next call, I guess. Mr. Vaughan, please.
I'm going to speak up on behalf of the experiences from Prince Edward Island that you brought up around the way in which we've broken up EI into a fragmented systems that work differently in different jurisdictions, even though economies are changing in every different jurisdiction. And what we heard about the lack of consultation and the lack of understanding of local conditions was really troubling as it relates to PEI, and the sort of one side of the street gets EI, the other side of the street doesn't. It just doesn't make sense, especially in a community that is as fine-tuned and as granular as it is in PEI. But in the context of the urban space, where 70% of workers don't get EI, period, no matter how much they pay into it, there is a real there's a rigidity to the way EI sort of looks backwards to fix itself instead of looking at real life circumstances now and looking forward as to where we know the economy is going. And so from my perspective, the way in which the EI Commission makes those reforms, I think has to become as nimble as the computer we want them to use. And it's not. Even though I know we're in the process, we at the point where we were about to appoint the new commissioner, and then life circumstances took over and we had to start again. There's nothing you can do about that when a candidate has to be removed from just at the point of being selected. We had a tripartite conversation where you have a traditional employer, a traditional workforce representative and a traditional government response, but we just heard that there probably is a seat at the table for the new emerging gig economy, which is way out in front of all of that. There's probably also a need for the difference between large businesses and small independence businesses, which use EI very differently. The large corporations use EI as a training mechanism. In the smaller communities, EI is almost a way. We heard from many witnesses today, there's a lifeline to keep small businesses alive when there are sudden and unexpected economic turndowns. I think we're kind of locked into an historical evaluation process that doesn't work, and we haven't modernized the evaluation process so that reforms are made in real time as the funding is adjusted in real time. And that lack of flexibility and nimbleness in the commission is how PEI and I would say Toronto landed in the same space for very different reasons. And so the commission changes and the consultation process and the diversity of consultation processes needs to be made much more public, much more accountable, and much more obvious to all parties involved around the table. Otherwise, we're going to repeat the mistakes by using the same old evaluation system and governance system. And I think that would address PEI and the gig economy or freelance or contract work economy, which now become so prevalent in large urban spaces.
Well said, and thank you. Ms. Doncho.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I appreciated Madame Chabot when she said to emphasize to include the submissions, that the paper copy submissions. I think that's key. And then Mr. Vaughn, I agreed with Mr. Vaughn on the technology side wholeheartedly. That was one of my notes I had, that there should be a section on that alone. I think it would warrant, given there were so many. Well, it just sounds like every time we hear, every single meeting we've had, folks comment on this. So I'd really love to see the analysts dig into everything that we've heard on that. And there should be some recommendations, or at least one, I would hope, about that specifically. And it should be a bit more specific than just, it needs to be fixed. Like, it'd be great if there were some specifics as mentioned by the witnesses. I think that may be the most important in order to kind of,
maybe it should just be fix it.
Yeah, fix it. Something like that. So I do agree with Mr. Vaughn there, and I think it should have its own section, and particular detail should be paid attention to that. On the CERB, again, I agree, Madame Chabot, I think I both agree. And it sounds like Mr. Vaughn, you agree as well, it should be included. I would say it warrants more than just an appendix mention. I do think it is quite significant, the undertaking of CERB and why it was needed. Then particularly we see an overlap between the EI and the CRB, the second iteration of CERB. Sort of that evolution, the very quick evolution over a year's time should be outlined, and how that interacted with EI and how it made up for the shortcomings. Again, I do feel that that'll inform a lot of what the EI recommendations would be, given lessons learned from CERB. And for the analysts, it was the OAG report. It outlined a number of the good things about CERB, a couple of the shortcomings that we saw. But I think that's a really bountiful resource for writing the section about CERB and the process that we've seen the last 13 months. So I would ask the analysts to take a look at that and include some of the information therein. One more thing. Sorry.
Yep, go ahead. Yep.
I do think, I know that the most recent budget included a number of announcements for EI as well. It would be pertinent, of course, to include those. I know kind of they happened as we were wrapping up the study, but I don't know what Madame Chabot thinks, but it may be nice to include the more recent announcements and then include them in the costing as well, since that will influence any reform given the new changes that were brought forward. So I don't know what the other committee members think, but there should be a mention and a little bit of analysis in the cost section, and wherever else the analysts feel that they should fit in. But we would be remiss if we did not include the latest announcements in this report.
Madame Chabot.
Thank you so much. There are so many good ideas, but my greatest wish, and let me tell you that, well, this time around, there were so many reports, 2016 amongst others. But a lot of work has been done by the Employment Insurance Commission. The fact that there are no commissioner, well, it's most unfortunate for employers. but it didn't stop the Commission from working on several files, including regional differences, including Prince Edward Island, or our regions are set up, some studies going on, and we should have conclusions to that. When we talk about the context and what we had to set up as emergency measures, if you look at CERB and 3 other programs, some of these measures were flexible towards employment insurance. Those were temporary measures. We have to say that those measures were temporary, but things happen. The 420 hours and the other standards. Some things have already been done, and they're still temporary, but as far as information systems or IT, we still managed because we were more flexible, because the system was less complex, we were able to support these measures. So maybe these are kind of solutions to look for in the future. The employment insurance system is really heavy, and one of the recommendations is to look what is being done and what are the solutions. So now we are giving draft directives. I'm not already at the solution stage. I have some in my mind, but we have to look at what experts told us in this regard. That's it for me, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Madame Chabot.
Did you have a further intervention, or did we just not lower your hand? Okay, your hand has been lowered. That exhausts the speakers list. So I'm going to go back to the analysts to see if there are any questions arising from that direction. That was, of course, a bit disparate, as is often the case with drafting instructions, but just to see whether that helps as you embark on your work, or if you require any clarification before we seek a motion to adjourn.
Yes, it was very helpful. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay.
Yes, it was very helpful. Thank you very much.
Excellent. All right. Our agenda is complete. Do we have consensus to adjourn? I see consensus. We're adjourned. We'll see you all Tuesday. Thank you.